Well, good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us here, the intersection of faith and culture. This is the Meeting House on Faith Radio. It is great to welcome to the program Kimberly Holmes. It is a very timely conversation that we are going to have today here on this Friday before Valentine's Day as we think about healthy relationships and Christ-centered relationships and the institution that God has ordained and desires to work through, that, of course, being marriage. And Kimberly is the CEO of Marriage Helper. And we're going to talk just a bit about that organization. In fact, there was an op-ed piece that was on the Washington Times website earlier this week, really extolling marriage, especially in light of media outlets that have been promoting the benefits of divorce and not necessarily offering what we would call a Christian worldview perspective, if I can put it like that. So, Kimberly Holmes, let me welcome you to the Meeting House on Faith Radio. Tell me about Marriage Helper.
Yes. Well, Bob, I have to start by telling you about how Marriage Helper got started. So it actually, the story behind it is my parents, my mom and dad, back in the 1980s, they actually ended up divorcing. My dad ended up leaving my mom. He had even been a pastor, was very well known. And they ended up divorcing. They were divorced for 3 years. And during those 3 years, my dad would be the first to tell you that he became a person that he didn't know anymore and that he didn't like. And so at the end of that 3 years, he quote unquote woke up one day. We know it happened a little quicker or a little slower than that. But he said, I want my old life back, and I want to see if my wife will take me back. My mom's name is Alice. And so she called him, and everyone in her life said to not do it. But she said, you know what? I know that my husband is a good person who has done some bad things, but I believe this is the right thing to do. And so even though they did not love each other then, they had 2 kids at that time, my 2 older sisters, and they got remarried and they figured out how to fall in love with each other again. And then a couple of years after that, they had me as the celebration of their remarriage. And so I owe my life to 2 people who said, even though they had divorced, even though all hope was against them, even though they, from the world's eyes, didn't even have a right to go back together, I wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for 2 people who viewed the sanctity of marriage and viewed what true love was, which isn't what society tells us, and wanted to make it work. From their testimony, they said, how can we use this to help other people? Because divorce is rampant, and a lot of people do not believe that there is hope. And so about a decade and a half later, my dad created an amazingly powerful 3-day workshop that we believe is fully given to us from God, that was given to him back in the 90s from God. And it has over a 70% success rate at saving marriages, even those that are on the brink of divorce, where divorce has been filed, or they have been divorced, or they're separated. And so that's how Marriage Helper came about. That's why I'm involved with it, why I'm passionate about it. And that's what we do to help couples.
What an amazing story. And I want to circle back and talk about the relationship between your mom and dad. But I would like for you to give us maybe a general overview of, well, how Marriage Helper saves marriages.
Yes, absolutely. Well, at Marriage Helper, we believe that every marriage can be saved. And we have seen so many people, Bob, who they're pastors, they're counselors who intended good, but have said, maybe you should just divorce, because those people hadn't seen that marriages, even in the most dire of circumstances, could have a turnaround. And we see that at Marriage Helper. The way that we see that is the biggest one I said is our 3-day workshop that we have, which has been around since 1999. So over 20 years now, thousands of people have gone through it. It has an amazing success rate. And in that 3 days, we don't force people to stay married. We simply share with them the research and biblical-based principles that lead to creating a strong and healthy relationship. That's what we do. And we do it in the most non-judgmental, respecting environment anyone could ever go through. Because at our workshops, I would say 90% of the people who come have a spouse who doesn't even want to be there. They're totally checked out of the marriage. They don't want to be there. And yet at the end of that 3rd day, the Holy Spirit moves, God works, and lives are turned around and families stay together. It is very often we see people actually tear up their divorce papers. And it's even happened at our workshop at the end of the last day. That's the main thing that we do. But we also offer marriage coaching, and we also offer online courses that people can take from anywhere in the world as well.
So, what went wrong with your parents' marriage? Why is it that they ended up in divorce? How did either he or both of them get off track?
Great question. And I've heard both of them tell it over the years. And honestly, a lot of it stemmed from the fact that my parents didn't show a mutual respect for each other early in their relationship. And so each of them were trying to do things to change the other person. They had started growing apart. They weren't listening to each other. My dad had a very stressful job, especially being a very well-known preacher back in those days. He was traveling a lot, gone, and my parents didn't stay connected as well as they should. And so, it came to a point where my dad at the time felt like he would be happier not married. And then, of course, once they divorced, he realized that that was not true, that the lie that society tells us that if you're not happy in this marriage, you can find happiness with someone else or with something else. He realized quickly it's not true. It's just not true. He was chasing a dream that ended up feeling really empty inside of himself. And so when he came back to my mom and asked her to remarry him that 3 years later, I mentioned before when they got remarried, both of them would tell you right now, we did not love each other, but we knew it was the right thing to do because of our children, because of our commitment that we had originally made to God, and they made it work. And I am blessed to have grown up with two parents that I have seen work things out. I have seen them disagree and learn how to communicate with each other and solve that disagreement. I've watched them go through the good and the bad, and that has helped me 100% in my marriage to realize divorce doesn't have to be an option, because I've been able to see my parents work it out. And that's what I believe people need to see more of. I believe people, especially children, need to see more of their parents learning to work things out, because that's going to be what prepares them for the most success in the future.
Kimberly Holmes, CEO of Marriage Helper, joining me today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio. Well, Kimberly, you wrote a piece, as I mentioned earlier, for the Washington Times that actually was published earlier this week. And at the very beginning, you quote the American Family Survey, the first major survey, as you note, on families in the pandemic, finding that 34%, so around a third of Americans overall, say the pandemic has increased stress in their marriage. For those households that faced economic setbacks, the number rises to 45%. And there's a major online legal provider saying they've seen a 34% increase in requests for divorce paperwork. Comment on what you've seen from your perspective, your position, leading an organization that is designed to preserve, to save marriages. What have you seen the COVID-19 pandemic do?
An interesting thing we've seen is more couples who have been married a shorter period of time. So the couples who it's been less than a year, 2 years, 3 years, and maybe they don't have kids yet, coming to us and saying, we don't know if we made the right decision. I may have married the wrong person. So we've definitely been seeing an increase in that specific demographic this past year. But just overall, in January, I was hosting a webinar with several hundred people and asked, how many of you did your marriage issues come to the forefront because of the events of 2020? And hundreds of people responded, 2020 is when it all really came to light. I believe what's been happening, Bob, is that people have been just trying to push things under the rug for years, but our busy schedules, our busy lives have allowed us to ignore the issues that have been there all along. But because of the events of this past year, with the stress, the schedule changes, all of those things, the rug has now been completely taken up and thrown out, and all of the dust is there. So now couples are really having to say, are we going to address this? Are we going to fix it? Or unfortunately, what secular media is saying so much of is, or should we just divorce because that's easier? But the lie is that divorce is easy. Divorce is not easy. It's not the easier option.
And in this op-ed piece, you actually call attention to a couple of articles, one in the New York Times, another one in Parents Magazine, with
Yes.
respect to divorce, and really, in a sense, painting a more rosy picture than, as you had said, is really accurate. So comment on the gist of what these media outlets were saying, in a sense, promoting divorce.
I remember when I was sitting on my couch and first saw the article from Parents, and it was talking about the benefits of a COVID divorce. And they were talking about how, and the New York Times is echoing a similar sentiment, which is that with a COVID divorce, you can get rid of the stress in your life because for 2 weeks out of the month, you'll have all the time to yourself. This is especially true for people who have children. You have all the time to yourself. So you can have self-care, you can focus on your work, you can excel there. And then the other 2 weeks of the month, you can be a present parent and you can have that time with your kids and you'll be even more attentive to them because you won't be as stressed out. So they were promoting this as an option, as a great option to get rid of the stress that we've experienced from this year. But Bob, oh my goodness, when you look at the research and the data, none of that backs it up. Children need two parents in the same house. Children best thrive when their parents learn how to work through the issues, can see their parents work through things, and have their parents stay together. There's a misnomer of research that's been said over the past decade, at least, that children are better off when their parents divorce if their parents fight a lot. Now, what research does support is that the parents should learn to not fight as much, right? Like parents need to learn how to communicate better and all those things. Absolutely. But the worst thing that can happen for a child is that their parents divorce and they still fight. And that's typically what happens when people divorce and they're learning how to co-parent. They don't get along. And that's the worst thing that could happen for a child. And then when you just look at the amount of the percentage of fathers that lose touch with their children after a divorce happens because they get remarried or because of that strife between the mother and the father, it starts at a 50% average after the first year of a divorce and goes up to 64% of fathers who no longer have really constant communication or connection with their kids over 10 years. 64%. That is insane. And we know that children need a mom and a dad. We know that this is what's best for them. It is just unethical, I believe, for any media outlet to promote divorce. Now, does divorce sometimes happen, and especially to people who don't want it to? Absolutely. Are the children doomed? No, absolutely not. Kids can be resilient. But the point here is that we don't go to divorce as the solution. The divorce is the last thing that happens, and everything else is exhausted before that. That is what should be promoted.
You are listening to Meeting House here on Faith Radio. The CEO of Marriage Helper, Kimberly Holmes, joining us here on today's edition of the program. Well, we're talking through this opinion piece that you wrote for the Washington Times website. You can find it at washingtontimes.com. And Kimberly, let's wrap things up. Let's leave our listeners with some hope here, especially after our last portion of the conversation. And in this piece, you say data and research concludes there are two keys: taking care of our spousal relationship and taking care of ourselves. Those are components as you relate to marital success. So tell me how that can be built in and really, as we might say, unleashed or deployed in a marriage relationship.
Absolutely. I'm going to start with the last part of that, which so much of the change that can occur in our marriage actually starts when we begin to make a change within ourselves. And at Marriage Helper, we call it the pies of attraction. So pies stands for physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And they're actually the 4 areas of attraction of what can attract a person to us and makes us attractive to someone else. And when we're talking about a romantic relationship like the ones with our spouse, then that type of attraction never stops being important. So Physical, yes, but it's all about how do I feel physically in my body? Do I have energy? Am I doing things to where I want to be active and doing things with my spouse? But intellectually, it's asking yourself, am I doing what I can to have great conversations with my spouse? Am I doing what I can to be a fascinating person to talk to, continuing to learn and grow? That E of attraction is the emotional attraction, which says, am I evoking emotions within others that they enjoy feeling? And this was a huge one for relationships with our spouse, because many times, especially after we get married, we stop really focusing on what we might be doing that is evoking positive emotions, or that we need to stop doing that might be evoking negative emotions. And then that S is spiritual attraction, which is, am I living in line with my beliefs and values? This could look like your daily Bible reading, connecting with God, journaling, being part of a small group, going to church. All of those things really help increase our spiritual attraction. It's amazing how when we start with this, when we start with ourselves, scripture tells us to even do this. Scripture tells us to do this. Instead of looking at the log in your brother's eye, or the needle in your brother's eye, take out the log of your own. So we need to focus on being the best we can be first. And then that's going to have a positive impact in our marriage. That's actually validated by research. When people increase their own self-esteem, it actually increases their marital satisfaction as well. But that next part of it is, after I've worked on me, and I'm doing that because I want to be the best that I can, then I also am now more readily able to focus on being a really great spouse to my husband, or for the men listening, a really great husband to my wife. And so some key things, just easy things that we can begin doing to nurture that spouse relationship, is starting with asking each other questions. Fun questions, like you did probably when you were dating. My husband and I played a question game when we were dating, which was literally that simple. We would go back and forth just asking random questions. And we stopped doing that, unfortunately, once we got married, because for some reason we thought we knew everything about each other. But that's not true. We continue to develop and grow every single day of our lives. So an easy thing to do is ask fun questions, do some of the things that you did when you were dating, and really take time to listen to your spouse when they talk to you. Not listening to fix, but listening to empathize and understand. Just some quick areas that you can start making some changes in.
Very good. Well, with some help, pun intended, for marriages today, here on this Friday before Valentine's Day, Kimberly Holmes, the CEO of Marriage Helper, joining us here on the program. And Kimberly, if people want to find out more information about what you do, how can they connect online?
You can find us at marriagehelper.com, and you can see all of the resources that we have there. You can also see many free videos that we have on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/marriagehelper.
Very good. Kimberly Holmes, thank you for spending some time with us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio.
Thank you, Bob.